What happens when arrogance meets quiet strength? When a man of power belittles someone he thinks is beneath him, only to discover that respect can come from the most unexpected places. Stay tuned, because this story will leave you speechless. And don't forget to subscribe to Simply Stories for more powerful stories like this one. The grand ballroom shimmered with excess, a place where wealth and power gathered beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers. The walls glowed with golden light, bouncing off polished marble floors and reflecting in the eyes of diplomats, entrepreneurs, and investors from every corner of the world. The air was filled with the murmur of deals, the laughter of egos, and the clinking of glasses filled with rare wines. Every guest carried themselves like royalty, their suits tailored, their gowns stitched with luxury that spoke louder than words. In that atmosphere of superiority, where pride and arrogance floated, as easily as the notes of the live orchestra, one man moved quietly, unseen by most yet present in every corner. The waiter. Dressed in the uniform of his station, he carried trays laden with drinks and plates with practiced precision, his steps steady, his posture upright, his expression calm. Though overlooked by those he served, his professionalism spoke volumes. He bowed his head politely at each table, his voice low but steady, offering what was asked without hesitation, his very presence a lesson in composure. Among the guests sat a figure impossible to ignore, the Chinese billionaire whose reputation preceded him long before he entered the room. Known for his sharp tongue and booming laughter, he had built his empire not only on ruthless business tactics but also on the way he dominated any room he entered. He enjoyed it when all eyes turned to him, when his words commanded reactions, when laughter erupted because he had willed it so. That evening, as the banquet reached its peak, his attention shifted from his peers to the man serving them. Watching the waiter glide past, poised and silent, the billionaire smirked, his sharp eyes narrowing. Here was an easy target, someone who could not retaliate, someone powerless in comparison to the towering figures seated at the banquet tables. And with that realization came his opportunity to entertain. Clearing his throat, he raised his glass, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. With a sly grin, he made a remark about the waiter's appearance, twisting it into a cruel joke that mocked his very presence in such an elite gathering. The laughter came, soft at first, hesitant, because no one wanted to be the first to laugh, at another man's expense. But when the billionaire's booming chuckle filled the room, others followed, eager not to appear stiff in front of someone so powerful. The waiter continued to move with the same calmness, his face betraying nothing, as though the words had slid past him without weight. He set a glass before a guest, adjusted a plate at another table, never pausing, never breaking his rhythm. His silence only seemed to encourage the billionaire, who found the lack of reaction insulting, almost provoking. And so, the jabs continued, each one sharper than the last. He mocked the waiter's intelligence, questioning aloud how someone like him could possibly manage even a simple task in a room filled with greatness. He laughed at the idea of him ever understanding the sophistication of the world they lived in, and with every word, the guests around the table roared louder, feeding on his arrogance. Some laughed out of fear of being singled out themselves, others because it was easier to follow the power in the room than to resist it. Yet there were also those who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the billionaire and the waiter, uneasy with the cruelty unfolding before them. The music from the orchestra faltered slightly as if even the musicians were distracted by the growing spectacle. Glasses clinked, not from cheer but from nervous hands trying to mask their discomfort. The waiter remained steady, his hands precise as ever, his eyes cast down only when politeness demanded, never in shame. The more he refused to crumble, the more frustrated the billionaire became. His jokes grew louder, more cruel, digging deeper into stereotypes, seeking to crush the man's dignity in front of an audience that had now split, half entertained, half appalled. The air thickened with tension, laughter clashing with silence, arrogance colliding with dignity. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his smile stretched wide as he raised his voice above the murmurs, making one final, cruel jab, this time challenging the waiter directly. His words echoed across the hall, daring him to respond, daring him to break. The guests leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the scene, waiting for the reaction that would either cement the billionaire's dominance or reveal something entirely unexpected. And as the waiter stood there, tray in hand, unmoved by the storm of humiliation, the silence that followed felt heavier than the laughter that had filled the room only moments before. The night had shifted, and everyone knew it. Something was about to happen. The waiter's hands did not tremble, nor did his expression flicker under the weight of ridicule. Instead, with quiet precision, he placed the tray gently on the nearest table, the sound of glass against wood soft but final, like a signal that something had shifted. He straightened his back, his posture no longer just that of a servant, but of someone carrying an unshakable calm. The billionaire, grinning with the confidence of a man certain he had humiliated his target, leaned back in his chair, expecting silence, shame, or perhaps a stammered excuse. Instead, the waiter lifted his gaze and fixed it firmly on the man who had mocked him. Then, with a steady voice, he began to speak, not in English, nor in the quiet tone reserved for service, but in flawless Mandarin Chinese, each syllable clear and commanding. The effect was instantaneous. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter cut off as if choked by invisible hands. The clinking of glasses stopped, and even the soft hum of the orchestra faltered into silence. Dozens of heads turned, eyes widening in disbelief as the sound of elegant, flowing Mandarin spilled from the mouth of the very man who had been mocked only moments before. Guests exchanged startled glances. Jaws slackened. Eyes narrowed in curiosity, and a collective stillness swept through the hall. For a moment, the room felt like it had frozen in place, every soul anchored to the unfolding spectacle. The words themselves carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were deliberate, measured, and precise. The waiter's tone was respectful, yet within it lay an undeniable firmness that struck deeper than any insult could. He spoke of humility, weaving his sentences with a grace that seemed to cut sharper than steel. He reminded the audience, in their host's own language, that true greatness was never measured by the ability to belittle another, but by the strength to uplift. He quoted proverbs familiar to every ear in the room, ancient words of wisdom, cherished in Chinese tradition, that arrogance brings one low, while humility raises one high, that a person who mocks another often reveals more about his own weakness than his target's. Each phrase flowed like poetry, smooth and unbroken, echoing, through the grand hall with the cadence of a scholar rather than a servant. The billionaire's smirk faltered almost immediately. At first, he tried to maintain his mask of superiority, lifting his chin as though the words were beneath him. But, as the waiter continued, his mastery of the language became undeniable. It was not the clumsy mimicry of a tourist or the rehearsed tone of a student. It was eloquent, confident, rich with meaning. The proverbs were not recited but lived, their delivery carrying an authority that turned the room into a classroom and the waiter into the teacher. The billionaire's laughter never returned. His lips tightened, his eyes shifted uneasily as though searching for an escape. For once, he was not in command of the room. All the power he had held minutes earlier dissolved in the stillness that now surrounded him. The same crowd that had laughed at his jokes no longer dared to move, their eyes drawn not to him but to the man he had ridiculed. The silence was heavy, pressing against the walls, the kind that made every word land harder, each syllable like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. And still, the waiter never raised his voice, never returned insult for insult. Instead, he offered dignity. He told the room, in Mandarin, that respect was not earned by wealth or status but by the way one treated others, especially those without power. He reminded them that the true measure of a person's character was not how they treated their equals, but how they treated those they believed to be beneath them. His tone was neither bitter nor vengeful. It was steady, calm, and filled with conviction. He spoke not to shame, but to teach, and that made the words land all the harder. When his speech reached its end, he allowed a pause to linger. The silence, stretching so long that the guests leaned forward unconsciously, waiting for more. Then, with a slight bow, graceful, humble, and deliberate, he stepped back. His eyes did not drop in submission but remained steady, acknowledging the crowd with respect without surrendering his dignity. The bow was not of a servant, but of a man who knew his own worth, a gesture that carried centuries of meaning wrapped in simplicity. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not loud but sharp, as though they had all exhaled at once after holding their breath too long. The guests exchanged glances of astonishment, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it was almost tangible, hanging in the air like a storm that had suddenly turned. Where once the billionaire had stood as the center of attention, now he was diminished, overshadowed by the quiet composure of the man he had mocked. The billionaire sat frozen, his face drained of its arrogant glow. His glass remained untouched, his lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, his usual weapon, his voice, his ability to dominate, had failed him. The silence of the room bore down on him, and in that silence everyone knew the truth. The man he had tried to humiliate had instead revealed himself as the stronger, wiser figure. The billionaire could not respond. He had been defeated, not with insults or anger, but with grace, wisdom, and the very language he had claimed as his own. For a long moment after the waiter's final bow, the grand ballroom was frozen in silence, as though the very air had been stolen away. Then came the whispers, soft at first, slipping between tables like wind weaving through tall grass. Guests leaned toward each other, eyes wide, voices hushed, repeating the same question again and again. Had they truly just heard flawless Mandarin from the lips of the man who had been mocked so mercilessly? The disbelief gave way to murmurs of awe, and the silence cracked when one pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant, uncertain, as though the person feared breaking the spell. Another followed, then another, until the sound multiplied, filling the space where laughter had once rung so cruelly. Within seconds, the applause swelled into a thunderous ovation, echoing against the chandeliered ceiling and rolling like a wave through the hall. The billionaire, who only minutes before had basked in the spotlight of mockery, now sat stiff in his chair. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of forced composure, but his eyes betrayed him, darting nervously toward the waiter who now commanded the attention of the entire room. The very people who had laughed with him moments earlier no longer looked in his direction. Their focus had shifted, their admiration fixed squarely on the man he had tried to humiliate. In that sudden reversal, the billionaire shrank, his towering presence reduced to something small, brittle, and forgettable. Guests began rising from their seats, their curiosity overcoming hesitation, moving toward the waiter not as though approaching a servant, but as though approaching a peer. Their questions came with genuine respect. Where had he learned to speak Mandarin so fluently? How long had he studied? How could he speak with the elegance of a scholar when his station in life gave no hint of such mastery? The waiter, standing calmly among them, did not puff his chest or bask in pride. Instead, he answered with humility, his voice steady but modest. He told them of nights spent with books borrowed from libraries, of hours of study squeezed between shifts, of practicing words in the quiet corners of kitchens and hallways where no one noticed him. He revealed how he had worked jobs no one envied, scrubbing, carrying, serving, yet never allowed hardship to dull his thirst for knowledge. He believed, he explained, that learning was a form of strength, a way to command respect without demanding it, a way to stand tall without needing to raise his voice. The crowd listened, their faces softening with admiration, their eyes reflecting something deeper than respect, something closer to reverence. They recognized the resilience in his story, the perseverance that had carried him through struggles none of them had faced. What he possessed could not be bought with fortunes or inherited with a name. It was carved from discipline, carved from dignity, carved from the refusal to bow in spirit even when circumstance demanded he bow in body. Each word he spoke only heightened the sense that he was no ordinary waiter, but a man who had carried himself through storms and emerged stronger, his silence a shield, his knowledge a sword. The billionaire, desperate to reclaim control, forced out a laugh that rang hollow in the charged atmosphere. He raised his glass as though trying to lighten the mood, attempting to pass the moment off as harmless fun, a joke taken too seriously. But no one laughed with him. The guests, once so eager to echo his humor, now ignored him completely. There, smiles were turned toward the waiter, their admiration radiating like a current that left the billionaire isolated, stranded in the very crowd he had commanded. The harder he tried to force levity, the clearer it became. His power had vanished, replaced by the quiet strength of the man he had ridiculed. In that ballroom of gilded ceilings and gleaming marble, a remarkable transformation had taken place. A man of vast fortune, whose voice had once dominated every gathering, now sat invisible in his own kingdom, while a man who carried no wealth, no status, no title, now stood as the center of gravity without even trying. The balance of power had shifted completely, not through force or arrogance, but through dignity and wisdom. The waiter had not demanded respect, and yet he held it. He had not sought admiration, yet it was freely given. His silence, his composure, and his mastery of language had achieved what wealth could not. As the crowd continued to gather around him, as hands reached to shake his, as voices rose to praise him, the billionaire's patience snapped. He pushed back his chair with a screech against the marble floor, the sound harsh and discordant in the midst of admiration. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched, his steps hurried as he stormed toward the exit, the grand doors swinging wide with his retreat. No one followed, no one called after him. The applause did not pause, the admiration did not falter. He left, not as a man of power, but as a man defeated, slipping into irrelevance while the one he had mocked remained in the glow of the ballroom's respect. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone present that the story of the evening would not be about wealth or status, but about the quiet strength of a man who had turned humiliation into triumph without ever raising his voice. The great ballroom did not return to its former self after the billionaire's stormy departure. The chandeliers still glowed with the same golden brilliance, the orchestra still played softly, and glasses were still filled with vintage wine, yet something in the air had changed completely. The atmosphere, once swollen with pride and competition, now pulsed with something far more profound. Conversations no longer circled around profit margins and global ventures. They circled around respect, dignity, and the quiet lesson they had all witnessed. Guests who had moments earlier laughed at a cruel joke now found themselves reflecting, their tone softer, their laughter measured, their eyes drawn back, again and again, to the waiter who had shifted the balance of the evening with nothing but composure and wisdom. The waiter resumed his duties as if nothing had happened, moving through the room with the same steady hands and calm presence he had carried from the start. Yet now every step he took commanded attention. When he placed a glass on a table, the guest receiving it thanked him with sincerity. When he adjusted a plate, the diners leaned toward him, their expressions warm, as if honoring not the service he provided but the character he embodied. Though his uniform remained the same, he no longer blended into the background. He was seen not as a servant, but as a man whose quiet pride carried a weight that rivaled the fortunes and reputations of everyone present. Without asking, without seeking, He had become the most respected figure in the room. As the evening drew on, the story began to grow wings. Guests whispered it as they departed the ballroom, retelling each detail with awe. How arrogance had risen and fallen, how dignity had stood unshaken, how a man, mocked for his place in society, had spoken truths in a tongue not expected of him. By the following morning, those whispers had spilled beyond the walls of the hotel. They appeared in articles, carried in headlines that questioned the dangers of arrogance and praised the strength of humility. Reporters framed it as a moment when wealth was silenced by wisdom, when status was undone by grace. Around the world, the tale spread, retold in boardrooms, classrooms, and cafes, always with the same morale. Never underestimate the quietest person in the room, for their silence may carry a power greater than any voice. The billionaire, once adored for his success and envied for his wealth, found himself under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. His behavior at the banquet became the subject of criticism, not only for the cruelty of his mockery, but for the fragility he displayed when faced with dignity he could not break. What had been meant as entertainment became a stain on his reputation, a reminder to many that arrogance, when left unchecked, often brings its own downfall. Invitations that once arrived eagerly began to dwindle. Associates who once laughed at his jokes kept their distance, unwilling to be tied to the man who had been so thoroughly humbled in the presence of his peers. Meanwhile, the waiter's story was celebrated. Though he sought no recognition, his name became known, his intelligence and dignity praised as an example of perseverance. He was remembered not as a servant who endured humiliation, but as a man who had risen above it with wisdom and restraint. His humility became his strength, his patience his shield, and his eloquence his triumph. For many, he symbolized the idea that true greatness is not found in power or fortune, but in the way one carries themselves when challenged. The lesson was simple, yet it resonated deeply. True strength is not measured by wealth, power, or the loudness of one's voice. It is measured in dignity, the ability to stand tall without arrogance, to speak without venom, to endure without breaking. It is found in patience, the kind that waits quietly until the right moment arrives. And it is found in wisdom, the ability to know when silence is enough and when words, carefully chosen, can reshape a room. That night reminded everyone present that the quietest person can, with a single act of courage, carry the loudest truth. As the narrator reflects on the story, the message is clear. It is easy to be swayed by the glitter of status and the noise of arrogance, but true respect is earned by the way we treat others, especially those who stand before us without power. Every word, every action carries weight, and in the end, humility outlasts pride. The waiter did not win by shouting, nor by striking back with cruelty. He won by embodying grace, by turning a moment of humiliation into a lesson the world would not forget. And so the story closes with a gentle reminder to every listener. Look around you. Notice those who are overlooked, for they may carry a strength greater than any title or fortune. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because their silence often hides the wisdom that arrogance fears most. For more stories that remind us of the power of respect, subscribe to Story Tier and never miss a lesson. That could change your perspective.